Hi, and welcome to today's session about demystifying NIS2. We're excited to be here to talk a little bit about our experiences working with NIS2 and our own perspectives on it. First, let us introduce ourselves quickly. My name is Alex. I'm a management consultant at Implement Consulting Group, working as part of the Cyber and Information Security team since around 2 years. I have a background as a business lawyer from a university in Switzerland, where I'm from, and a master's from Copenhagen Business School. And I'm here today with my colleague Ulrik.
Yeah, that's me. I'm also part of Implement Consulting Group. I have been here around 3.5 years, coming in from a background as a lawyer, working with compliance and security for around 8 years now. Very interested and very passionate about making sure that compliance requirements is actually something that creates value in the organization. And I think this perspective on NIS2 is fits very much into that.
We have quite an exciting program prepared for you today. We have split our presentations in 3 parts. As the first part, we will be giving you a little background information about what NIS2 is and the purpose of NIS2. Then we will spend a few minutes on talking about who NIS2 is actually applicable to and what the requirements are if NIS2 is applicable to you as a company. And then lastly, we will also share our own reflections that we have gained or information that we have gained from our experience working with NIS2 in the sense of what a project could look like.
Like Alex said, we'll start by saying a few words on the purpose and the background of NIS2. So first of all, I'll be saying a bit about why the EU actually deemed that it was necessary with a new set of legislation in this area, and also what the directive's approach to cybersecurity actually is. So NIS2, if you don't know, is a new cybersecurity directive from the EU. NIS stands for Network and Information Systems, so I think it's very clear what the directive is about. And since it's a directive, it means that it has to be what's called transposed into national law. So each member state within the EU have to adopt the directive into their own laws for it to apply. Since there is a 2 at the end of the name, I think it speaks for itself that it's replacing another directive that is in force now called the NIS directive. And the reason why the EU has chosen to update the directive is that they think that the current rules, they're no longer fit for the increased digital world that we are in and the cyber threats that are related to this digital world. So basically the overarching purpose of NIS2 is to help organizations in the EU be better at defending themselves against cyber threats, and ultimately what they are protecting in this directive is the citizens, so the services that are being provided to the citizens of the EU. So basically, if we take that a step down and say what is NIS2 about, well, it means that organizations that are covered need to take what is called a risk-based approach. You will hear us saying that a lot today, but a risk-based approach to cybersecurity is what it's all about. And one of the things that NIS2 greatly expands on is the number of organizations that are covered compared to the current NIS directive. So it will have a really big impact. And that's also something that the EU tried with this new directive, because in the current situation with the NIS directive, the member states have implemented it very differently. So in Denmark, the types of companies that are covered may be very different from the same in Sweden. And that's some of the things that the EU is trying to amend by this. But we also get back to that later. The new directive will come into effect in less than 5 months, actually in October. So we are also very quickly approaching the implementation deadline. So if you haven't heard about NIS2 before or just getting into it, I think now is the perfect time to actually get to know it a bit more.
Thank you, Ulrik, for giving us this introduction to what NIS2 is. I will spend the next minute or so giving you a brief summary about what NIS2 is. NIS2 is a huge piece of legislation with a lot of pages, a lot of text. When it comes to the key things that you should know about when talking about NIS2, you can basically refer to the 5 points shown on the slide. First of all, as Ulrik said, NIS2 introduces the concept of a risk-based approach, meaning that organizations need to take different security measures to protect themselves and their information, but that those measures need to be appropriate to the actual risks that they're facing. So not everything needs the same amount of protection. Then also what NIS2 introduces is a requirement to report incidents if incidents still occur, which they do, unfortunately. That incident needs to be reported to the authority within 24 hours as the very first report, and then followed up by another report 72 hours, and after 1 month with a full extensive report of what has happened. But more importantly, at least what we believe is that NIS2, what NIS2 will bring is a change of perspectives about security, especially for the management level. NIS2 requires that the management bodies will have to be involved in their cyber and information security work of an organization, and they need to be trained in cybersecurity risk management. The involvement, or the bigger involvement of management, is also exemplified by the possibility of management being personally liable for infringements, meaning if a company would not uphold to the minimum requirements, it could go as far that the management body could be suspended, for example, from the exercise of the role. And lastly, as in with a lot of the legislation, there can be hefty fines if a company doesn't comply with what is required.
And with that out of the way, I think we are ready to move into the next part of our presentation, where we will say a bit more about applicability and then the security requirements in NIS2. When we say applicability, that basically just means that you're covered by the legislation. So if it's applicable to you, then you need to follow the rules just to get that out of the way. So basically, when we talk about who is covered by this, who this applies to, there are 3 basic conditions that need to be met, all of them for an organization to be covered. First, it has to have what we call activity in the EU. Second, it needs to be part of the specific industries that are covered by NIS2. And third, it needs to meet a size requirement. And I think before we go into the specific of each of these requirements, it's very important to say that the assessment of whether a legal entity, as it's called in the directive, is covered or not, you don't assess the entirety of the organization at once. You actually, at least in principle, have to look at each legal entity. So if you're in Denmark, that would be each CVR number has to be assessed by themselves. So the question is not, are we covered or not, but usually to what extent are we covered? What parts of our organization needs to follow this, and maybe some parts don't need to follow it. So I will now go through the 3 conditions in a bit more detail. So I think that the first one, having activity in the EU, is pretty self-explanatory. That is either if you have your establishment, your company is registered in the EU, or if you deliver your services or provide your goods within the EU. What I would like to summarize from this is that even if a company or an entity is not registered in the EU, it could be covered. We've had clients that had companies all over the world where they actually need to adhere to this because their primary market was the EU. For the second condition, we've actually listed all the different sectors here on the slide to the right. And as you can see, the scope is extremely broad and covers everything from energy to health to digital infrastructure, public administration, manufacturing, food production, beverage production, and even space is covered as well. So for the third condition, with some exceptions, the entity needs to employ more than 50 people and have a turnover of at least 10 million euros. And just one thing to be aware of here is that when assessing size, you actually don't only consider the specific legal entity, but also connected entities, as it's called. And that's obviously because you shouldn't be sort of outside the scope of the directive, because you split up your activities into multiple smaller entities. So that's just something to be aware of. And then something that's very important to consider here is that, like Alex will come back to later, NIS2 has a specific requirement for supply chain security. So that means that the entities that are in scope for this legislation, they actually are required to impose security requirements on their vendors or their suppliers. And that also means that the directive may be what we call indirectly applicable to entities that are not directly in scope. For instance, let's say that a health organization has a IT vendor, and the IT vendor is not in itself in scope. It's maybe too small, or the specific services it provides is not a part of the directive. But that entity, the vendor, would still have to fulfill the contractual requirements imposed by it by the health organization. So the range is actually very broad and also way broader than what we have here on the slide. That is something to be very aware of, I would say. Just to give you an example of what this directive actually looks like, so you can see what assessment needs to be made. We just want to illustrate that it can actually be quite difficult to ascertain whether you are covered or not as an organization. And that is because if you open the directive, it doesn't just say energy or health. For each of these sectors that are covered, it lists a number of subsectors that are covered. So you need to figure out, are you an electricity provider, for instance, or a distributor? And that is something you need to figure out actually by looking into the underlying legislation. So it can take a bit of time to dig into this.
Now, with Ulrich having explained what needs to be true or needs to be confirmed in order that NIS2 applies to a company, we are moving on now to what the actual requirements are once we have established that the company is in fact covered by NIS2. And what NIS2 basically says is that covered organizations need to implement appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures to manage cyber and information security risks. Unfortunately, the NIS2 directive doesn't provide that much clarity or doesn't go into the specifics. But what NIS2 does outline is it writes or it says that companies need to apply measures across a variety of security domains. How much is required within each domain? That is also not given by the NIS2 directive, but basically follows a company's unique risks and therefore a risk assessment. What you can see on the slides here are that the requirements or the measures referred are usually a combination of technical measures that are applied on information systems, but also organizational measures. And when I talk about organizational measures, that could be the creation of policies and procedures and defining roles, who does what, who's accountable for what, who actually has the task to ensure that your assets are inventoried, for instance. But also it goes about the human resource security, where the main purpose is that the employees working for an organization should also be screened. For example, that they are suitable for the role, that employees do not pose a risk to an organization's information and business processes. Above all is the requirement that management is involved, that management oversees the cyber and information security measures taken by an organization and also approves those measures, which is the entire governance around. So as you can see, the NIS2 requirements, they are quite broad, not that steep. Usually when we work with organizations, helping them assess those requirements, we try to be a bit more specific by working with the control frameworks, such as ISO 27001, such as CIS-18, that companies might already be using to provide a bit more clarity what is actually needed within each of those columns. Now, having briefly provided an overview about what the requirements are, we would like to give you also a practical example of how we work with NIS2, how a project that we do on a day-to-day could look like. And I'll just move on to the next slide and give you a brief introduction to that. As I said, a NIS2 project that we do on a day-to-day basis can look like or can follow the steps shown on the screen, where we would first start with assessing the applicability of a company, ensuring that we are aware of which parts of an organization are actually in scope of NIS2. And I think Ulrich will just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Thank you. So first, if your organization consists of a lot of different legal entities, you should consider bundling them before you make the assessment. For example, we've helped a client that had more than 400 legal entities. And for this client, making 400 legal applicability assessments wouldn't create a lot of value and it would take a lot of time. So we bundled the different entities into sort of clusters corresponding to the different types of entities in the organizations. That could be sales companies, production companies, IT provision companies, stuff like that. And that really helps us a lot with actually making this more tangible and also making it easier for our client to maintain the assessments that we help them make. And second, you also need to consider the way that you document an assessment like this, because it has two parts. It has a part that is more static, not completely static, but more static, that sort of encompasses the legal principles of the assessment. So these types of companies are covered by NIS 2 for these particular reasons. But it also needs a very, very dynamic document that has all the legal entities within the organization listed, and that can be updated when the organizational structure changes, so that you can actually stay up to date for which companies are covered and which are not, without having to going into the principal legal assessments that you have made. And third, we also think that it's very important that you use this legal applicability assessment actively in your implementation efforts. So it's not only a piece of legal documentation that you can show to the authorities. It should actually also have a strategic and tactical purpose for your project. And that means, for instance, that you start out when you start implementing NIS 2 or you start assessing your current security level, that you start with the entities that are, for instance, directly in scope of NIS 2, because that might pose a larger risk to you than the ones that are only indirectly in scope or not in scope at all. So that's an example of how we can actually use the legal work to make a better project and make a better implementation. I think that is a very important point.
So once we have established what the applicability of NIS 2 is, we are getting our hands a bit more dirty and usually start with a gap analysis to figure out where the company actually is right now in terms of the minimum requirements that I have elaborated on earlier. The way we are doing those gap analysis or this assessment is usually twofold. We want to provide the organization a full picture of their security posture. And we are usually doing that by having a organizational or governance capabilities assessment, where we are having interviews with the company stakeholder. That can be people from IT, from security, from facility, from HR, across the organization that might have a responsibility for security, and also review documentation. So that means the policies and the procedures that the company has in place of how they are actually managing their cyber and information security risks. In parallel, there is also a technical assessment conducted, where our technical specialists do samples on an evaluation of the technical infrastructure of the client's networks and systems, but also do technical verification of what the company might have defined that they do in their policies, whether it's actually true and implemented within their systems. This usually gives us quite a good insight into where the company is in terms of their security and how they would live up to the requirements right now, which is then used as the basis for the action plan to improve their security posture. And the way we are using the action plan is basically to try to create coherent and logical initiatives where we take the findings from the gap analysis, bundle them into logical parts or groups, and prioritize them based on how urgent those are, based on the findings we had from the gap analysis, but also how what the impact of those initiatives are on their risks, but also how easy they are to implement, but also what the company's ambition is and what the available resources are for the company. So this is usually a tailored roadmap that the company can take action on afterwards.
And then I would say after all of our assessments are done comes the really difficult part, and that is actually making this work in real life, implementing it into the organization so that you actually become better and use it practically. And we also have a few pointers on stuff that we've seen in the real world that we just want to take across here. First of all, I would say it's very important that you allow yourself to become smarter, not only as a person, but also as an organization. We are still in the early days of the NIS2 lifespan, and case law authority guidelines will help remove some of the uncertainties in the current phrasing of the requirements. Like you said before, Alex, it is very general still. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't begin now, obviously, but it does mean that you should prioritize the apparent and obvious security and compliance gaps over potential minor uplifts. So start where you know that there is going to be a need that needs to be addressed. And second, and that's also something that you've shortly touched upon, is that it's very important that you secure support from management and get the necessary resource allocation as a part of your project. That is something that we've seen fail if you don't start out by doing that. So if you identify that the current resource allocation is not enough to reach an appropriate level of security and compliance, you need to initiate a dialogue with management as quickly as possible. Like you also said, Alex, it is ultimately their responsibility, so they should be interested in helping you out. But we've seen this happen a few times where it becomes more an IT project and it becomes a business project, and that is not something that you should strive for, I think. And also, you should remain very firm on the security and compliance impact you want to achieve, but you should try to stay soft on the specific deliverables. So that means that compliance requirements, threat landscapes, and business needs may change over time, and that also means that some of the specific documents that need to be made or how they look might change, and your implementation efforts must be flexible enough to accommodate such changes, so that you focus on the impact that you want to have, getting more secure, more compliant, more than a specific policy that needs to be made. Everything needs to happen to better that purpose. And I also think that it's very important to be pragmatic here. The perfect is the mortal enemy of the good, as we usually say, and it's not advisable to strive for perfect compliance in the first iteration. So we would say it's way better to stay rational throughout the implementation efforts and have the courage to finalize the implementation phase, even if you don't consider the situation perfect. I think that is an intricate part of being working in security, that you need to always better yourself. You will never be done either way, so you need to not necessarily go all the way in the first iteration.
And yes, as Ulrik said, so NIS2 is part of an ongoing new lifestyle. It's not a one-off project. Where the improvement and continuously getting better is part of the new normal. So therefore, we also strive to prepare our clients for taking over of the work that we are co-creating with them, that NIS2 and the new processes and the new controls that have been implemented, that they can also continue to function and can be improved over time, because as Ulrik also mentioned, the organizational context can change, the threat landscape can change, risks can change. So it's about staying flexible and adaptive and not being firm on one control that has been established once, but trying to take this as a dynamic piece that will be nurtured and improved upon going forward.
And I also think that means helping your organization establish what are our goals, so that management can actually keep on following up on what is going on. So what we call KPIs, key performance indicators, can be a way to sort of ensure that you have a continuous improvement throughout the organization, and again, avoid this one-off project approach.
When we said that companies should continuously strive to become better, we also need to have some sort of standardized way of measuring where a company actually is, to ensure that the assessment but also the improvements are standardized. You can use a maturity model, which is shown on the screen. It is a 5-scaled model where the maturity and the so to say the effectiveness of security increases with the level going up. Just a brief walkthrough to that, to give you a few examples, where when we are having an interview with a client in the gap analysis, and they might say, we are not doing anything for screening our employees, or it's only done very on an ad hoc basis, it's not defined, following a defined procedure, then this would be qualified as a level 1 ad hoc. But Usually we are advising our clients that a level 1 or 2 is not sufficient to be in control of your security risks. NIS2 demands that the organization is in control of security, and therefore we are usually advocating for that companies have their security requirements defined in a standardized way that is applied across the organization, that the roles are allocated, that people know what is required from them, and then even measuring the performance of their security controls where it matters the most. And I think with that, over to you, Ulrik.
And this is just a different visualization of what you just said, Alex. So basically here we have a scale that on the one axis we have a security level based on the 1 to 5 that you just, a maturity level based on the 1 to 5 that you just mentioned, and then the effort that it takes to reach that maturity level. And the reason why we think this is a good sort of model, this can be visualized in a lot of different ways. But what we want to say is the reason why we are not necessarily advocating for 100% optimized security across the board is that will take up immense resources. As you can see, as you move across the scale up to number 5, there's a very sharp intake on the amount of resources required to maintain security. So that's also why that we say you need to figure out with your management what is a good level for us, what is our risk appetite and risk tolerance and our threats, and then base your security off of that. And it's very difficult to say, you need a specific 3.4 score across this model to be in compliance or be in control. We wouldn't give that guarantee. But this visualization basically says that you probably need to be somewhere between 3 and 4. And it depends a lot on your sector, on your threat level, on the specific risks. What would be a good place for you? A place to sort of start with this is to look up in the CFCS, their yearly report for threat levels, which I think is a good place to see sort of what is the sector threat level for us and maybe start your assessment from there.
And having done quite some NIS2 projects over the past 1.5 years, we have also identified some key prerequisites that we deem important for successfully implementing and approaching NIS2. One that we have addressed and mentioned a couple of times throughout this presentation is that management is actively involved and management is committed to NIS2, meaning that sufficient resources are provided, that there's an interest in NIS2 with reporting, with taking an active part in approving the risks and the risk management measures. But also we have figured out, or we have identified, that a common understanding of the company's risk tolerance and also ambitions is really important. There can be multiple perspectives and assumptions across the organization if it is not clearly defined, not defined by management or agreed upon management. And if the risk tolerance and the ambition is not clearly set, NIS2 technically is also not really addressed appropriately, because the risks need to be, or the risk treatment measures, the measures referred earlier, need to be in proportion and appropriate to the risks faced. And a large organization might be willing to accept more risks than a smaller organization. Hence, it will always depend on the unique company-specific context. Lastly, since, as said, a risk-based approach is required, there should also be an overview about what processes are actually really critical for an organization to function and what assets are supporting those processes to function. These are just the 3 reflections that we had over the last month. And we just suggest everyone working with NIS2 to consider those 3 prerequisites when dealing with NIS2.
So if you are in an organization that you think could be covered by this, I would say don't wait. Go up, knock on the door of your management and say, have you actually considered this? Because this is not an IT project, this is a business project that not only will increase your compliance and ultimately security, but that can also drive positive business development, competitive edge, trust, and stuff like that. So really focus on how we can leverage this into something that is positive for the organization and not just another set of requirement goals that you need to fulfill.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that is very nicely put. And that also marks the end of our presentation. So thanks so much for tuning in. And please feel free to reach out to us on our email, or you can also scan the QR code if you want to connect on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you.